You won't believe that these rich and famous celebrities got their houses foreclosed on. Nicolas Cage. Back in 2013, Nicolas Cage was named the 5th highest paid actor in Hollywood by Forbes, who claimed he was earning $40 million paychecks. That's a lot of cash, especially when it seemed like he'd had a role in almost every major blockbuster of the 2000s. So he must have been rolling in money, right? Well, not exactly. Not everything was working out behind the scenes. Accusations soon leaked to the media that Cage's business manager had been mismanaging the actor's funds badly. But he hadn't just been leading Cage down a path of financial ruin, he'd also been lining his own pockets with insanely high fees for his terrible service. In the end, he'd propped up his wallet with $20 million that once belonged to Nicolas Cage. That's a lot of money to pay a financial advisor who's not doing his job. We might never know exactly what happened, but we do know that Cage clearly had a rough time after that. Despite being one of the highest paid actors out there, a whole collection of his houses started appearing on the market. It started in 2009, when 2 New Orleans homes owned by Cage that had a combined total of $6.8 million were auctioned off. At the time, CNN claimed that Cage owed $150,000 in real estate taxes and an eye-watering $5.5 million in mortgage payments. And his New Orleans property was just the start. Just 5 years later, they came after his California mansion. The 12,000 square foot Bel Air home was Cage's passion project. It had 6 bedrooms, a castle-like tower, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a private cinema, and a custom-built wine cellar. Cage had tried to sell it for over $30 million, but in the end, it was auctioned off and sold in less than a minute for $10.3 million. That must have hurt. Poor Nicolas Cage didn't do anything to deserve losing his houses, but the things the next person on our list was doing in his mansion will make you think it was a good thing it was taken away. R. Kelly. We know what you're thinking. R. Kelly is in prison for some terrifying crimes. Obviously, he lost his house. But this foreclosure actually happened way back in 2013, 7 years before his conviction. In fact, it was the house where most of R. Kelly's shocking crimes took place. The 22,000 square foot Illinois estate, located about 30 miles outside of Chicago, was his dream home. It featured an incredible jungle-themed swimming pool and a private cinema. At one time, it was valued at an impressive $5 million. But unfortunately, he wasn't going to get to keep it. He had failed to make mortgage payments for over a year, and he was slapped with a $2.9 million foreclosure suit. He tried to fix the situation himself by putting the house on the market as a short sale for only $1.6 million. A huge loss on the $5 million it was really worth. But it didn't sell. He dropped the price right down to just $995,000. And even then, nobody wanted it. In the end, he was forced to give up after he was notified about $5 million worth of unpaid taxes he needed to hand over. After the foreclosure, the grand house eventually sold for only $950,000. So R. Kelly was blowing it even before he went to prison. But the next star on our list was a Hollywood legend when his home was possessed: Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds was a legendary star of the silver screen, playing in hit movies like Smokey and the Bandit and Boogie Nights. But despite his status as a Hollywood legend, his finances started collapsing in the years before his death at 82 years old in 2018. Back in 1980, he bought a lavish Mediterranean-style estate in South Florida. The impressive mansion sits on 4 acres of land and comes with everything a star could need: a swimming pool, a boat dock, a cinema, a private beach, and even its own hair salon. But in 2009, Reynolds realized he was in a bit of financial trouble. So he put his dream mansion up for sale for $9 million. Only it didn't sell. 2 years later, he was taken to court. It turned out that he hadn't made a payment on the home in a decade. That's a lot of payments to miss, and it added up to $1.2 million. At the time, the house was only valued at $2.4 million, a lot less than Reynolds had hoped. There was pretty much nothing he could do to stop the foreclosure. He'd already filed for bankruptcy way back in 1996 after a messy divorce and a failed investment in a restaurant chain. That got even worse when he was sued by an ex-girlfriend. After that, he began missing out on paying taxes. and by the time of the foreclosure on his home, he owed $225,000 in state taxes. It just goes to show, it doesn't matter how big the star is, they all stand a chance of losing it all. Let's step out of the glittering lights of Hollywood and the music industry and move into the world of sports to meet our next celebrity, Warren Sapp. Warren Sapp was once the best defensive tackle for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Oakland Raiders. During his time with the NFL, he earned a whopping $77 million. But in 2012, he was still forced to file for bankruptcy. At the time, he was nearly $7 million in debt, and he only had $1,000 in his account. And his mansion in Windermere, Florida was the first thing to go. Which must have been pretty disappointing because the 10,000 square foot Mediterranean-style property was spectacular. It had 4 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a river, a gym, a wine cellar, a cinema, an outdoor kitchen, a private dock on Lake Butler with a jet ski lift, a swimming pool, and its own water slide. The home was once valued at $7 million. But that's a long way off from what it actually sold for at auction. It was only bought for $2.9 million. In other words, while a $7 million sale would have wiped out Warren's debts, he now had to go looking for more things to sell. Tragically, it was his sneaker collection that was put up for auction next, and he had to wave goodbye to 200 pairs of Nikes. As if that wasn't bad enough, he also had to auction off a boxing glove signed by the great Muhammad Ali. It must have been heartbreaking. It's pretty tough to go from being a star to being broke. Just ask this Hollywood actor, Stephen Baldwin. Actor, producer, and director Stephen Baldwin has spent decades with his name at the top of the big releases like The Usual Suspects and even the Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas. He's also known as Justin Bieber's father-in-law these days. But no amount of money kept him out of financial trouble. It started in 2012 when he was finally charged with failing to file state tax returns. It was revealed that this had been going on for years. He owed $300,000 and received 5 years probation for the crime. In 2017, the problem started again. 17 years before, he'd taken out an $812,000 loan to buy a white and green cottage in Upper Grandview, New York. The charming property even had views of the Hudson River, but by 2017, he'd defaulted on the mortgage payments of $7,000 per month, and the bank came after him. They claimed he owed them $1.1 million including interest. The only option left for Baldwin was foreclosure, but sadly, it didn't really help. His home sold for only $100 at the auction, which didn't do much to help with the $1.1 million he owed. He's not the only big-name actor who lost his home either. Here's another, Kristen Bell. The Bad Moms and Couples Retreat star Kristen Bell ran into financial troubles back in 2012. 6 years before, she'd bought a house in Studio City, LA for $3.1 million. The 5,500 square foot Mediterranean-style house was built in 1969, and Bell hired the famous Los Angeles decorator Stacy Baduras to come in and give the property a makeover. 3 years after that, it even got its own feature for InStyle. And only 3 years after it became famous in its own right, Bell lost it. She'd moved in with her then-fiancé at his ranch in Los Feliz, and she defaulted on her mortgage on her own house. It was foreclosed on and sold at auction, but we guess Bell could look on the bright side. After all, at least she wasn't homeless when they took her house, unlike some of the other stars on this list. She also hadn't been taking care of it. The lush garden filled with lavender and jasmine had become overgrown, and the pool looked more like a swamp. The person who bought it at auction probably loved it more than she did. Still, losing your house has got to be pretty bad. But there is something worse, losing 2 houses. That's exactly what happened to the next star on our list, Allen Iverson. NBA Hall of Famer and 11-time All-Star Allen Iverson earned tons of money throughout his career, but it wasn't enough to save him from losing 2 houses. In 2011, he very narrowly avoided foreclosure on his 6-bedroom Denver mansion, and he'd only had it for about 3 years. The gorgeous property came with views over a lake, a whopping 7 gas fireplaces, a chef's kitchen, and a top-of-the-range security system. He'd bought the property for $3.9 million. When it went up for auction, things weren't looking good. But right at the last second, Iverson found a buyer for the house. That was obviously a good thing, but he didn't earn his money back. He sold it for less than $2.8 million, making a loss of over $1 million. Sadly, that wasn't his only problem at the time. He was suffering from substance abuse problems, and his marriage was breaking down at that moment in his life. And it wasn't over. In 2013, another home he owned was put up for auction, and he might have loved this one even more than the one in Denver, because instead of buying it, he built it. That must mean it was exactly what he always dreamed of, including a custom-built bar and a gourmet kitchen. He only had his dream home for 4 years before it was foreclosed on. The 10,000 square foot home in Atlanta was auctioned off for $2.5 million, less than half of what it cost him to build it. I think we can all agree that's a pretty sad story. Iverson isn't even the most famous sports star on our list. The next name coming up is gonna shock you: Evander Holyfield. Evander Holyfield is one of the most famous boxers who ever lived, and for good reason. The 4-time heavyweight champion earned an incredible $230 million over his career. And you could tell by his mansion just how famous he was. The 105-acre property had a 45,000 square foot house at the center, with a whopping 109 rooms. It also came with a totally separate 4,000 square foot house where one of his ex-wives lived. And amazingly, the property could be found at 794 Evander Holyfield Highway. That's right, he was famous enough to have the house on a street named after himself. He'd built the home himself, creating his dream home. Its list of luxuries is mind-blowing. It had a 135-seat cinema, one of the largest home swimming pools in America, a boxing gym, and even a bowling alley. Sounds like a dream, right? He lived there for 2 decades. He might have stayed forever, but in 2013, his home was foreclosed on. It turned out the house wasn't as much of a dream as you'd imagine. Holyfield later confessed that the house was costing him $1 million a year to maintain. Just putting up lights over the festive season came with a bill of $16 grand every year. He now owed the bank millions and another $200 grand in back taxes. The home sold for $7.4 million at auction, which sounds like a lot, but it was less than half what he owed at the time. Oops. Want another boxing champion? Yes, there's another one on our list. In fact, he got himself into trouble for an offense against Holyfield. Can you guess who it is? We'll tell you. Mike Tyson. Heavyweight champion Mike Tyson won almost 90% of all the matches he fought in the 80s. That incredible track record brought in a lot of money, an estimated $375 million in fact. It was around this time that he bought a 13,500 square foot mansion in Southington, Ohio. It had 6 bedrooms, an enormous pool, and not just one, but 2 kitchens. Oh, it also had 3 cages installed for his controversial Bengal tiger pets. But it was all downhill from there. In 1992, he was convicted on assault charges and spent 3 years in prison. The legal fees and lack of earnings added up pretty quick. But he was about to lose his career too. While he survived the conviction, he finally lost his boxing license when he bit Evander Holyfield. It was a huge mistake. More assault charges followed, and another year-long prison sentence. In 2003, he couldn't bounce back anymore. He filed for bankruptcy, and his house was put up for auction. But it only sold for $4.1 million to an entrepreneur. Finally, the home was converted into a church named the Living World Sanctuary. It doesn't quite match up to its former glory. But that house isn't the only thing not living up to the life it once had. Hollywood stars lose their glory in the blink of an eye, which is what happened to our next star, Erin Moran. Happy Days star Erin Moran was one of the most famous faces of the 70s. She was on every home's TV screen. She was living it up from her former days as a star right up until 2010. Suddenly, her Hollywood dream came to an abrupt end. It was revealed to the world that she owed $315 grand to the bank, and her home in Palmdale, California was foreclosed on to help pay the debt. Unfortunately, it didn't entirely fix her problems. It only sold at auction for $290,000, but that was far from the end of her stress. She refused to leave the house, even though it had been sold, and she had to be evicted. And where she went after that was pretty depressing. She was forced to move into a trailer that didn't even belong to her. It was her husband's mom's trailer, and the couple became her caregiver after moving in with her. But even that didn't last. They were kicked out of the trailer park, and she was reported for causing disturbances with her husband several times over the next few months. Tragically, she passed away 7 years after being kicked out of the trailer park. She was only 56 years old at the time. But not all celebrity foreclosures are a bad thing. One smart celebrity worked out how to use a foreclosure to his advantage. But who is it? Millionaire. Rapper Millionaire shocked everyone when his mansion was foreclosed on in 2010, but it turned out it wasn't foreclosed on in a traditional sense. He's clearly pretty money smart, and he came up with a very unique idea. The mansion in question was an impressive $2.3 million, 8,000 square foot pad located just outside Houston in the upmarket Woodlands neighborhood. But his dream life in that house never really happened. He was touring all the time, which meant he was never there. Then, to make things worse, the 2008 financial crash meant the value of his mansion dropped, along with the rest of the real estate market. Despite the market crash, his mortgage was still huge, and it was costing him a lot of money. Eventually, he revealed he actually wasn't ordered to hand his mansion over, but he figured it wasn't really worth keeping it anymore. So before he was foreclosed on, he decided to give his mansion over to the bank voluntarily. They sold it for $1.8 million, which pretty much cleared his debt without him having to do anything or show up in court. Sure, having your house repossessed is normally a bad thing, but Millionaire actually used it to his advantage. It seems he now has a new mansion. It's not quite as big as the last one, and it's not in such an expensive neighborhood, but it's still pretty impressive, and it's probably costing him a lot less. It's not just celebrities who run into financial problems, it happens to billionaire businessmen too. In fact, you'd be surprised how much money these Chinese billionaires have lost since the start of 2023. What did they do to lose it all? You definitely want to find out.